In 2015, a researcher in Canada was browsing the website of a public health organization called the Global Energy Balance Network. The group had been publishing studies, hosting scientific conferences, and lobbying governments on the causes of obesity. It had credentialed academics attached to it. It looked on the surface like exactly what it claimed to be, an independent scientific body trying to understand one of the most serious health crises in modern history. Then the researcher, a man named Yoni Friedhoff, checked who owned the website's domain. It was registered to Coca-Cola headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. Coca-Cola was listed as the site's administrator. The organization had never mentioned that. Neither had any of the scientists running it. What Friedhoff had stumbled onto was the visible edge of something much larger. A $132 million operation, a coordinated strategy to reshape what the public and policymakers and journalists believed about obesity and sugar, and a direct line back to a playbook that had first been written 60 years earlier by the sugar industry at Harvard in a deal that influenced dietary science for generations. This is the story of how Coca-Cola paid scientists to lie to you, and how they weren't the first. To understand how we got here, you need to go back to 1954. That's when the president of the Sugar Research Foundation, the trade group representing American sugar producers, gave a speech outlining a calculation that would shape the next 60 years of nutritional science. The argument went like this. Research at the time was beginning to link both dietary fat and dietary sugar to heart disease. If Americans became convinced that fat was the primary culprit, if the national conversation focused on fat, not sugar, then a low-fat diet would become the prescription. And a low-fat diet meant people would need to replace those calories with something else, with carbohydrates, with sugar. The Sugar Research Foundation estimated that if Americans adopted low-fat diets, per capita sugar consumption could increase by more than a third. That was not a public health insight, that was a business plan. A decade later, the foundation's vice president, John Hickson, looked at the emerging scientific literature and did not like what he saw. Studies were accumulating that linked sugar to coronary heart disease. And so Hickson wrote an internal memo proposing that the industry fund its own research specifically designed to, in his words, refute our detractors. The target was Harvard University, specifically the nutrition department of Harvard's School of Public Health, one of the most influential nutrition research institutions in the world. The Sugar Research Foundation paid Frederick Stare, the chairman of Harvard's nutrition department, who was quietly a member of the foundation's own scientific advisory board, and a colleague the equivalent of approximately $50,000 to conduct a review of the existing scientific literature on diet and heart disease. It would be published in the New England Journal of Medicine. The funding was never disclosed. The internal letters between the sugar industry and the Harvard scientists, discovered decades later in a public archive, tell the story clearly. Hickson wrote outlining the foundation's particular interest in how studies linking sugar to heart disease should be handled. One of the Harvard researchers wrote back, "We are well aware of your particular interest in carbohydrate and will cover this as well as we can." When it was finally published in 1967, the paper concluded that fat and cholesterol were the dietary causes of heart disease, and that the evidence against sugar was weak and unconvincing. Hickson wrote to congratulate the researchers. "Let me assure you," he said, "this is quite what we had in mind." That single paper, published in one of the most trusted journals in the world by researchers at one of the most trusted universities in the world with no disclosure of industry funding, became a cornerstone of nutritional science for decades. It shaped how doctors thought about heart disease. It influenced government dietary guidelines. It pointed an entire generation toward low-fat eating and gave the food industry scientific cover to remove fat from everything and replace it with sugar. Nobody found out for nearly 50 years. The documents that exposed the Harvard study were published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2016. By then, generations had lived through the low-fat era. Between 1980 and 2000, precisely the decades when fat reduction was the dominant dietary message, obesity rates in America doubled. Today, roughly 42% of American adults are classified as obese. Heart disease, the exact condition that fat reduction was supposed to prevent, remains the #1 cause of death in the United States. The understanding of nutrition that most people still carry, fat bad, sugar fine, was seeded by a trade association that needed to protect its market share. But here is what makes this story more than a historical footnote. Because the same playbook did not stop in the 1960s. It evolved, it got bigger, and 50 years later, it was being deployed by a company worth hundreds of billions of dollars. By the early part of the decade that began in 2010, Coca-Cola had a problem. Soda consumption in America had been falling for years. Major cities were trying to tax sugar-sweetened beverages. Researchers were publishing studies linking sugar-sweetened beverages to obesity and type 2 diabetes. A growing scientific consensus was forming around the idea that drinks like Coca-Cola were a significant driver of the obesity epidemic. The public health community was winning the argument, and Coca-Cola knew it. In July 2014, Rona Applebaum, Coca-Cola's chief science and health officer, sent an email to a small group of academics with a document attached. The document was later obtained through a Freedom of Information request. It was titled Proposal for Establishment of the Global Energy Balance Network. Applebaum described the situation in terms that left no room for ambiguity. She wrote that there was a growing war between the public health community and private industry. She described public health researchers who linked sugary drinks to obesity as extremists pushing shrill rhetoric. And she laid out a plan not to produce better science, not to reformulate Coca-Cola's products, but to fund a network of university researchers who would advance a different narrative. That narrative was called energy balance. The concept sounds neutral, almost mathematical. Energy in, energy out. The idea was that obesity is simply a matter of whether you move enough to burn what you eat, and that focusing on what specifically you drink was missing the point. Under the energy balance framework, a can of Coke was not part of the problem. You just needed to exercise more. The scientific consensus says otherwise. In one of the most rigorous studies of exercise and weight loss ever conducted, 200 overweight adults followed an aggressive exercise program, more than double the federally recommended weekly exercise, for a full year without changing their diets. Average weight loss was 3.5 pounds for men and 2.5 pounds for women. Nearly everyone remained overweight or obese. Exercise is good for you. But the scientific consensus is clear. Diet, specifically excess sugar, is the primary driver of weight gain. The energy balance message was not a reflection of that consensus. It was a marketing strategy dressed in academic language. Applebaum's proposal compared the Global Energy Balance Network to a political campaign. It described developing a powerful and multifaceted strategy to counter radical organizations. It outlined plans to educate health journalists. It envisioned lobbying policymakers. And it explicitly framed the effort in terms of both policy and profit, Applebaum's own words. The network was presented to the public as an independent scientific organization led by respected university professors. Its president was James Hill, a nutrition expert at the University of Colorado with genuine credentials, World Health Organization committees, National Institutes of Health panels, and co-founder of the National Weight Control Registry. His credibility was real, so was the $550,000 he had received from Coca-Cola. And then Yoni Freedhoff checked the domain registration. When Freedhoff pointed out publicly that Coca-Cola owned the website, the funding disclosure was quietly added. By August 2015, the New York Times had published a full investigation, Coca-Cola had provided $1.5 million to establish the Global Energy Balance Network and nearly $4 million in additional funding to its founding members. Internal emails obtained by the Associated Press showed that Coke had helped select the organization's leadership, edited its mission statement, and suggested content for its website. Coca-Cola's CEO acknowledged there had not been enough transparency. Rona Applebaum announced her retirement. The University of Colorado returned its $1 million donation. On November 30th, 2015, exactly 3 months after the New York Times story ran, the Global Energy Balance Network announced it was discontinuing operations. It had lasted less than 2 years. After the exposure, Coca-Cola published a transparency list disclosing it had spent $132.8 million on scientific research and health partnerships over the previous 5 years. Read that number again. $132 million. By a beverage company on science. Independent researchers who analyzed that list found it was severely incomplete. A study identified 453 additional authors on 127 scientific papers that declared Coca-Cola funding. Those authors did not appear anywhere on the company's official disclosure. Researchers who had received Coca-Cola money were publishing papers without disclosing the conflict of interest. The Transparency Initiative was not fully transparent. The broader picture it reveals is this: a study examining industry-funded versus independent research on sugary beverages found that 83% of scientists funded by the food and beverage industry found no relationship between soft drink consumption and obesity. Among independent researchers, 83% found that there was one. Same question. Opposite answers, depending entirely on who was paying. This is the mechanism. It does not require scientists to fabricate data or consciously lie. It works through selection, which researchers get funded, which questions get asked, which results get published. The sugar industry used it in the 1960s. Coca-Cola used it in the 2010s. And the effect, accumulated across decades of published literature read by policymakers and doctors, is a distortion of the scientific record that shapes what people believe about their own health. People who followed the low-fat guidelines faithfully, who cut fat and reached for the products food companies reformulated with sugar to compensate, did not get the health outcomes they were promised. The obesity epidemic accelerated precisely during the years when the corrupted science was most dominant. That did not happen by accident. It was produced. And the company whose logo is currently on a bottle somewhere within arm's reach of almost every person on Earth spent $132 million making sure you stayed confused.